Hello and welcome to this week's episode of The Insider, brought to you, as ever, by Vanishing Inc. My guest today is a past president and life member of the Psychic Entertainers Association. He spent the last 25 years performing hard-hitting mentalism for audiences around the world. Until the release of his magnus opus, Calculated Thoughts, he's been somewhat of an underground name. But all that is changing now as his amazing book is landing on people's doorsteps all around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Doug Dyment. Doug, how are you this morning, afternoon, evening?
Well, whatever it is. Afternoon here, evening there.
Okay, that works. Doug, what's your origin story? You have 43 seconds.
Well, I've sort of had three careers in my life that have nothing to do with magic. I was a programmer for the first part of my career. I was a computer science professor at a Canadian university for the second part. And for the last part, I was what is called in the industry a technical evangelist. I used to fly all around the world and be the technical expert. And I worked for a variety of Silicon Valley startups. And it was during that period of time that I did performing. So I was what Carol Fox would have called a captive magician. That is, I never did public shows. I was always doing this under the guise of working for some technical company or another. So a lot of trade show work and a lot of, private corporate events of various kinds.
Sure. So actually, when I was researching you, I found a retro game website with some adventure game from 1978, maybe?
Yeah. Earlier than that, probably 1968. I was as surprised as anyone else with that one. Never been a gamer. I'm a computer guy. I'm a PhD in computer science and all that good stuff. But I've just never been a games person. I don't play video games or anything. But as part of something else, which is a long drawn out story, I happened to write a interactive computer game for a company I was working for at the time, Digital Equipment Corp, which used to be a big company. And
DEC, yeah.
And I wrote it, and it was used for something. And then, I wrote thousands of programs in those days, so I never gave it any thought. But maybe 10, 20 years ago, I started getting queries from random people who are doing research into computer games, and it turns out that I was the first creator of this style of interactive game. And many things have evolved from that, all unbeknownst to me.
Oh,
wow. So I was amazed as you are.
That's so cool. Now, computer games aside, for those unaware, there are some amazing resources on your website, deceptionary.com. I particularly loved the collection of essays on character and acting, and I'll link to this in the show notes. But one thing that leapt out to me as somebody that performs mentalism with a really defined character is Hagen's 9 questions. Now, for the listeners, I'll just run through what they are. And the questions are, who am I? Where am I? What surrounds me? What time is it? What are the given circumstances? What's my relationship? What's in my way? And what do I do to get what I want? Now, you know this, but if you look at any good performer, they'll all know the answers to all of those questions. But my question to you is, how should people begin to find the answers to those questions?
Well, it's usually not that difficult finding the answers. The difficulty, in my experience with most people, is they never ask the questions. They don't know what questions to ask. They've never thought about that as an issue. They just get up. They either try to pretend there's someone else, usually very badly, usually copying the latest video that they downloaded from somewhere, or they follow a common admonition to be like yourself, only bigger, which is not a bad piece of advice, pretty much what I did. But that's as far as it goes. They don't really look at acting and the whole stagecraft thing, so they're never exposed to those kinds of issues. Once you consider those questions, once they are asked of you, it's usually not that difficult. If it is difficult, good. You should be stopping and thinking about that. But I've never had people say to me, I can't answer those questions. I don't know the right answers. But I've had lots of people say to me, Oh, I never thought about that before. Do I have to think about that stuff? And to which my answer is yes.
But so you also think that the basics stagecraft, blocking and how to walk on stage is a thing that people should consider.
I do. I mean, it varies a lot on what kind of performing you're doing. If you're strictly a close-up magician, there's a lot of stuff you don't have to worry quite so much about. If you're doing trade shows, there's less that you have to worry about. But if you're doing stage shows, that's a huge part of what you do. And in all cases, blocking is a major part of what any magician should be doing. And you may not know it by that name because that's a kind of a crafty name, but it means, you know, where do your hands go? If you to get from this point to this point, what moves where, and you need to think about that. Is that going to hide something from view? Is that going to, you know, disturb people? Is that going to attract attention where I don't want it attracted? And on and on and on.
Sure. Why do you think the character is so important? And do you think it's more important for mentalism than close up or parlor or whatever?
I think it's important for both magicians and mentalists. I think it's a little bit more important for mentalists because a strong component of mentalism, the way most people perform it. I mean, some people perform it for laughs, or they're really doing what we mentalists call mental magic. So right. it doesn't apply quite as much. But for most mentalists, much of the interest revolves around the notion of, is this real or not?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a whole huge long discussion. But if you're attempting to promote thinking along those lines, to whatever level you want to make that a part of your performance, if you're attempting to do that, you have to be consistent in what you're doing.
Right.
So that means your character has to be well thought out. You have to know just what it is you can do and what it is you can't do, and how you do it as part of the effect, not mm-hmm. as part of how you really do it.
Yeah.
And that needs to be consistent.
Sure.
And for many, it isn't. Many mentalists get up and they do this kind of, one set piece followed by another set piece followed by another set piece, and it's like flipping through a magic catalog. There's all this cool stuff you can do, and there's no consistency to it, and it's not clear. It's not clear what the effect is, or you know. That's another point that I try to make. In the magic business, people use the word effect. I think I get to make the pronouncements here. I think they use it for the most part, not always, incorrectly. They use it as a synonym for trick. They don't want to say trick because somebody said, "Oh, you shouldn't call them tricks. Mm-hmm. That's not mm-hmm. good." So they say, "Okay, we'll call them effects." And that's just not right. There are plots and there are effects, and the plot is visually what you see. If someone were just kind of looking in on this and watching whatever it is you're doing, they would say, "Oh, he did this. He wrote this on a piece of paper. He put it in an envelope. Somebody did this. He opened the envelope, and in the envelope it said what that guy was going to do. Wow, how did he do that?" That is the plot. The effect is what the audience is intended to perceive as having happened. Did he mm-hmm. predict the future? Did he force them to make the selection somehow uh-huh. that he predicted?
Did he influence them? Or
physically did he transmit the paper in some secret way inside the envelope? What happened? That's the effect. The effect is what the audience is supposed to understand about what happened. The plot is what physically happened from an external perspective. I mean, the plot right. doesn't include how you did it, but sure. it includes what they see.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah, no. Let's get. I know you said it would be a long conversation, but I did have a question about that mm-hmm. dilemma that mystery performers have when deciding whether to claim that their powers are real or not. And I wondered how you felt about that.
My own take, I mean, first of all, whatever you say, 10% of the audience, and I just made up that number, 10% of the audience are going to think you're full of bull, that it's just, that's nonsense. Another 10% of your audience are going to think that you have powers that you got from God or an alien or something, and they're going to follow you and give you their firstborn. And the remaining 80% are not quite sure what to make of it all. So my goal has always been to play to that middle 80% in terms of what are you supposed to believe. And I've never, I don't make a disclaimer. That's a big discussion among mentalists. Should you make a disclaimer? I don't. I assume, I believe correctly, that the nature, the context of the performance is such that it's clearly a performance. You are there as an entertainer. They don't come on stage at the beginning of a Broadway musical and say, now everything you're going to see isn't real.
We're actors. We're just pretending.
Yeah, we're just pretending. Yeah. So on the other hand, I, of course, don't do the other either. I don't claim that I can read minds or something, but I strongly imply that I can read minds. And again, hearkening back to what I said before, I'm consistent in what I do. So they can come away from that experience with a vague understanding of what it is that they saw happen. And whether or not they choose to believe it is literally true or a theatrical performance, I leave up to them, because again, in my experience, they're going to believe what they want to believe anyways.
Yeah. I was a few years ago at a Darren Brown show here, and obviously he does the disclaimer at the beginning, and in the bar, in the interval, I heard people talking, said, I know he said that, but he's got to. He's got to, hasn't he?
Yeah, the lawyers made him say that, or the theater makes him say that. Or, I've heard that too. Yeah.
What do you think? That there's a big, in your book that we will talk about later, there's a big bit about it about centre tears. What do you think the main or common mistakes people make when trying to work with a centre tear?
Okay, let me answer that in two ways. Let me first of all say what I want to say about centre tears, but more as an example of something else, and then I'll directly answer your question. As you can probably tell by the title of my book, my own personal interest and connection and style of performing, for that matter, is very cerebral. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I don't mean that you have to be a Mensa member in order to do my material. That's not even remotely true. You don't even have to be a sleight of hand artist to do most of what I do. But I mean it in the sense that, and this is another thing I talk about in some detail in the book, I mean it in the sense that this stuff is really well thought out. I think the worst advice that you see it all the time in places like the Magic Cafe from people who should know better, but the worst advice you can give to a magician or a mentalist is, oh, you're overthinking this. Oh, they'll never see what you're doing. Don't worry about it. To me, that's just awful. It's just awful advice. The difference, unless you want to be a mediocre performer, in which case it's perfectly fine advice. But the thing that differentiates the Darren Browns of the world from the Joe Schmoes of the world is that the Darren Browns of the world have spent an insane amount of time thinking about every single movement. I mean, comedians who all they have to do is stand on stage and talk. I mean, they spend an inordinate amount of time worrying about not only the words they use, but the space between the words they use. It's a big
every
deal.
beat. Yeah.
And magic is absolutely any performance art, but magic in particular, mentalism, is no different. You have to think about everything, and you should always be worrying about it, and you should always be looking for, if I did this little tiny thing, it would be better. And do that enough times, and it gets really, really good. So one of the things that you have to be able to do in order to make the decisions that you need to make something better is you have to know where you are. And my personal background and training and livelihood really has always been as a scientist, as an engineer to a certain extent. And one of the first things you learn if you're that kind of a person, or if you lean in that direction, is that if you can't measure something, then you don't understand it. Then you have no way of knowing what it is. It's just an opinion. So you'll see all the time. Again, I pick on the Magic Cafe because that's where so many people seem to hang out. You'll see all the time, oh, this is better than that. This is the best
Yeah, what's
pass.
the best?
This is the best false shuffle, whatever. And it's just an opinion. It's just, maybe it's the best for you. Maybe it's the worst possible false shuffle for everybody else in the world. So those kind of things are just nonsense. You have to first figure out what it is you're talking about. How are you going to measure this thing? And then you have to, and then you can compare. You can put your special ruler up and say, well, this is a 7 and this is a 9. So this one's better.
Yep.
Now, whether the additive nature of all those 7s and 9s for any particular thing means that that's the best version of that for you is still a little bit up in the air, because it depends on your style and the matter of your presentation and other things that maybe aren't in that list that you need to be thinking about. But that's the place to start.
Sure.
And so when you talk about center tears or anything, center tears are a good example though, you get into the issue of how do we decide what is good and what is bad. And if you say, oh, well, this one's more deceptive, or this one's faster, or this one's easier to learn, or this one works with any kind of paper, most of those are purely subjective. I mean, what does it mean it's faster? It means from the start of when you tear to the end of the tear, it takes less time? I mean, isn't that more a function of what you're saying in all that period of time? What else you do? I mean, it's just so I never had any plans to do a center tear, but a friend of mine, Robin Robertson, came up with a clever idea of something that he thought it would be possible to do, and he himself, without talking to me about it, worked on it and came up with a way of doing it. Okay. And he showed it to me, and I thought, wow, that's a really great concept, but I don't like your way of doing it. It's just I don't like it. And so I went away and worked on it on my own for a while, for a few months. And in doing that, I did it the way I did most things, and the way my engineering/science background taught me to do. I sat down and made a list of how am I going to measure this thing when I'm finished? When I'm finished, as opposed to where I am right now, how will I know if I made any gains or not? So I started writing down things that you could measure. How many folds are there? How many, what is the worst case thickness of paper you will be required to fold? Are there any tears that start at the folded edge rather than the open edge? Because it's much easier to tear from an open edge than it is from a folded edge. And so on. There's a whole list in the book. In fact, there's a whole list of about 20, I think, criteria that I set for myself and used, and they're all objective criteria. That's the important part, is they can all be measured. It's all, it's not like, well, I don't know if it's, no, it either is or it isn't. It's a yes or no, or it's a numerical measure of some kind. So that's how I did my center tear, and that's how I do a lot of other things. To specifically answer your question of what is wrong with most people's, there's a lot, but the two most common things that I don't like about center tear, about other people's center tears, is first of all they rely too much on concealment. I mean, people know that they've written that thing down on a piece of paper. And so that's very suspicious. No matter what kind of a backstory you have as to why they needed to do that, smart people know that it's written down somewhere. So my job is not to read their minds, it's to find out what the hell is written down there. And so they're watching for it. And so the two biggest mistakes, I think, are, number one, there is visual concealment. The paper disappears for a brief period of time behind somebody's hand, and you can't really see what's going on. So that's a biggie. And the other biggie, and this is something really Bruce Bernstein used to go on about years ago, and it's in some of his books, and I 100% agree with them, is that people go. They try to get they're nervous. They've got this piece of paper in their hand. They're starting to do a trick. Mm-hmm. They're going to tear this paper up in such a way that they can peek inside of it. And all of that permeates their action. And so they want to get the scary part out of the way as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
So that then they can, now I've got it, now I can relax. And fine, I get that. But the problem is that's at cross purposes to what you're trying to do. You're trying to make them believe that you couldn't possibly read what's written on that piece of paper. So how do you do that? Well, here's how I do it. While I'm tearing it up, I look away. There's no way I could see what's on the piece of paper. It's physically impossible unless I had mirrors all set up around me or something. So I look away. So how can I do that? If I look away, I can't see what's on the piece of paper, right? Right. So what I do is I postpone the critical moment as late as possible in the procedure as I possibly can. So for the first, in my case, 3 or 4 tears, depending on what you're trying to do, for the first 3 or 4 tears, for the first 2 or 3 tears, I'm looking away. And by now the paper is getting very small, and it's clearly been physical impossible for me to see anything. And so now when I come to the final tear, which is where I actually get the peak, it's like it's over. They've forgotten. They've stopped worrying about whether I can see it. So I come back and I use something to justify why I had to turn back. But they're not worrying about it anymore because they know the paper's all torn up at this point, and you can't possibly see it. Oh, and I should have said earlier when I was talking about my initial concern that people, center tears, are hidden behind the hands or behind something or another. It's possible to design a center tear so that the things that are not supposed to be visible are hidden by the paper itself.
Right.
And you don't have to use your hands to hide them. So that's what Quarto, which is my version in the book, that's what it does. So it can be done completely at the fingertips. There's nothing hidden. You're never doing, this kind of thing. It's all at the fingertips. Everything is totally visible.
Excellent. Doug, many performers think that you shouldn't use playing cards in mentalism. What's your take on that?
I have a pretty strong take on it. But my take on it is that that's not a yes/no question.
Okay, expand.
And it doesn't apply only to playing cards. It applies to every prop. Playing cards just being a dramatic example of it. And so my position is simply that anytime you're using a prop as a mentalist, anytime you're using a prop, there must be some really, really good reason why you're using the prop. Otherwise, you would just stand there and read their minds.
Sure.
So there must be some reason why suddenly, out of the blue, you are holding this thing that you weren't holding a moment ago, and why are you holding it? So, and I talk about this in the book. There's a chapter on this issue, and so I say that any prop that you use must be justified. It shouldn't just appear and it's like, oh, I wonder what that's for. Or, oh, I wonder where you buy one of those. That's really cool.
That add a number pad looks a bit weird.
Yeah, all that stuff is like, ooh, I don't want any attention at all, if possible. Or at least minimal attention. It's a very common term these last few years has been the use of the word organic to describe that. So it should be organic. It should just flow as part of it. So rule number 1, every prop should be justified. And rule number 2, to the extent possible, it's not always 100% possible, to the extent possible, every prop should be self-justified. So it should not only have a reason for being there, but it should be obvious to the audience what that reason is. I shouldn't have to say, I'm using playing cards here because it is a common object and it has 52 images that everybody's familiar with. Okay, that's BS. If you really wanted to do that, why don't you use 50 postcards?
Yep.
You know, why are you using playing cards, which have such a strong association with two things in the world? Gambling, game playing and gambling, and card tricks. How many jokes have real people, not just us, but real people heard about magicians doing their card tricks? Do you like card tricks? No, so he did 5.
Yeah.
Okay, so everybody's heard those, and it's because of the strong association between card tricks and magic, which is it just. Look at the book. Well, you can't see my bookshelves from where you're sitting, but if you look at any collection of magic books, half of them are card trick books.
Yeah.
So and the public knows that too. They may not know that specific fact, but they know that cards are used for card tricks, and they're also used in casinos and things. So if you're doing some piece of mentalism that is illustrative of your abilities to cheat at poker, you know, or to remember every card that's ever been dealt in a game, then it would be natural for you to use playing cards. But if you're just, oh, I'm going to read your mind. In order to do that, I need you to pick a card, and I'll tell you which card you picked. Why would you do that? Where did the cards come from? Why are you carrying around a deck of cards anyway? I never heard of anybody who carried around a deck of cards. Oh, except my magician friend Bob. You know, he always has a deck of cards. So I mean, I'm sort of against, if I had to lean on one side of the scale or the other, I'm sort of against it because, and especially in the business world, you know, in the
why does it make a difference for business?
I don't know. There's something about if you do a lot of corporate work, the minute a deck of cards comes out, the first thing they think of is magician. So, in my experience.
Okay.
But again, you shouldn't have to explain why the deck of cards is there at all. There should be obvious why it's there, and it should be natural, organic, if you will, that it's there. So that's how I feel about that.